Imagine standing on a freezing African shoreline in 711 CE, staring at an ocean that could swallow you whole, knowing that if you cross it with a handful of borrowed boats, you might just change the fate of an entire continent. The morning air of April hung heavy and cold over the coastline as Tariq ibn Ziyad studied the vast, unforgiving waters before him and the jagged shadow of a land unknown to his people. This was no moment of divine ecstasy, but of sharp, ruthless calculation. He watched the currents, the hesitant sway of the small fleet he'd gathered, aware that the ancient world had called this narrow stretch the Pillars of Hercules. Soon it would be the gateway to his destiny. In this quiet, breath-held pause before the storm, the fate of Western Europe balanced on a few hundred men in fragile boats.
The story begins in the Maghreb, the western stretch of North Africa, a land of harsh mountains and resilient tribal peoples. Tariq, whose name suggests a heritage rooted among the Berber tribes, was born into a world of constant change, far from the established seats of power. His early life was characterized by the rugged independence and military skill intrinsic to his people, skills honed in the frontier environment where survival depended on adaptability and discipline. This was a realm recently annexed by the sprawling Umayyad Caliphate, an empire governed by Arab rulers in distant Damascus. The Caliphate itself was a geopolitical marvel, stretching from the deserts of Central Asia to the shores of the Atlantic, bound together by a formidable military and administrative machine. Tariq was a product of this new order, a local leader who pledged allegiance to the larger framework, serving under the Caliphate's provincial governor, Musa ibn Nusayr. His position was one of high military command, yet always secondary to the established Arab hierarchy. His immediate superior, Musa, governed Ifriqiya, a region corresponding roughly to modern Tunisia. Musa was a shrewd and ambitious administrator, consolidating the new territories and eyeing the lucrative, unsettled frontier that lay just across the strait, the Iberian Peninsula. For Tariq, this relationship with Musa was a defining feature of his career, a blend of mentorship, trust, and ultimately, rivalry. Tariq's command was not of grand, sweeping armies, but of compact, highly mobile units, primarily composed of his fellow Berbers. These men were light infantry and cavalry, disciplined and acclimatized to quick maneuvers, a force perfectly suited for rapid deployment and surprise attacks. They were not accustomed to the slow sieges of established empires, but to the swift, decisive action of raiders and frontier guards. Across the water, the Visigothic kingdom of Hispania presented a stark contrast. It was a realm of decadent, Romanized aristocracy, outwardly powerful, but politically frail. The kingdom was built on a fragile foundation of inherited wealth and widespread internal dissent. It was a society riven by deep fractures between nobles, the ruling elite, the peasant majority, and minority groups like the Jewish population. The reigning monarch was King Roderick, a ruler who had seized the throne through a violent coup, displacing the family of his predecessor, King Witiza. This act of usurpation created powerful, vengeful enemies within the Visigothic nobility, who stood ready to exploit any sign of weakness in Roderick's rule. It was this internal weakness, this political rot, that formed the true vulnerability of Iberia, far more so than its geographical defenses. The geographical distance between the Caliphate's reach and the Iberian Peninsula was minimal, yet the cultural chasm was immense. The strait was a formidable psychological barrier, marking the boundary between the known African world and the mythical, wealthy world of Europe. only exceptional circumstances could justify an attempted crossing. Those circumstances arrived in the form of a disgruntled nobleman named Count Julian, the Byzantine exarch of Ceuta. Julian held a personal, burning feud against King Roderick, fueled by slights and perceived dishonors. He became the crucial, treacherous link, offering Tariq vital intelligence, supplies, and most importantly, the use of his small fleet for the crossing. Julian's betrayal was not for empire, but for personal revenge. Tariq's world, therefore, was defined by three forces converging: the professional ambition of the Umayyad military machine, the local agile power of the Berber tribes, and the self-destructive political decay of the Visigothic state. He was positioned perfectly, as an outsider with the trust of one power and the critical assistance of another's enemy. The decision to cross was not made in a vacuum of bravado, but through a calculated assessment of risk and opportunity, heavily influenced by Musa. Initial probing raids had already tested the coastal defenses and confirmed the extent of the political instability. These small-scale successes proved the feasibility of a larger operation. Tariq was the ideal commander for this mission. He possessed the tactical flexibility required for a high-speed, unpredictable operation, and as a Berber, his motivation was deeply intertwined with the desire to establish the reputation and future influence of his own people within the larger caliphate. The Arab elite often viewed their Berber allies with suspicion, and success in Iberia was a chance to demand respect and equality. It was deeply satisfactory to see the wealth for which they had toiled in North Africa suddenly accessible to their taking. The task was handed to him as an independent command, a high-stakes military exercise designed to secure the southern ports and assess the full strength of the Visigothic reaction. This meant that the moment he set foot on the northern shore, the entire weight of the mission and the potential for disgrace or glory rested solely on his strategic choices. The true motive for Tariq was never solely the extension of the caliphate's territory. That was the grand political agenda of Damascus. For the man himself, the drive was intensely personal, a quest for status in a world where nobility was often defined by birthright, not merit. He aimed to transcend his standing as a Berber subordinate and claim a place among the greatest military figures of his age. His personal ambition was inextricably linked to the collective aspirations of his Berber soldiers. For centuries, they had been a fiercely independent tribal society, often subjugated or marginalized by whichever empire ruled North Africa. This crossing represented an opportunity to seize new lands and, critically, gain permanent, elevated recognition from the caliphate. He desired not just a successful raid, but a permanent, defensible home for his people on the European side of the water, a place where their prowess as warriors would guarantee their autonomy and respect. Iberia, with its fertile plains and mineral wealth, offered an escape from the barren austerity of their homeland. The lure was also pragmatic: wealth. Reports from Julian confirmed that the Visigothic treasury was vast, and the kingdom's decentralized governance meant many smaller cities could be secured quickly with minimal resistance. This promised enormous spoils, enough to solidify his command and reward his loyal, often underpaid troops. There was a deeper, more profound purpose, rooted in the mindset of a high-stakes military commander, to prove the efficacy of the light, mobile Berber forces against the heavy, slow-moving European armies. He sought to demonstrate that speed, strategy, and morale could shatter the rigid, established order of the West. Yet this ambition was shadowed by the rivalry with Musa ibn Nusayr. He needed a success so profound, so undeniable, that his superior could not easily diminish or steal the credit. The size of the prize had to be worth the inevitable political fallout that would follow his independent glory. To his men, Tariq spoke of destiny, of a land so rich that it would compensate for every hardship endured in the Maghreb. He painted a picture of a permanent settlement, of lands and titles secured for them and their families, binding their loyalty not just to a distant caliph, but to the promise of the commander who led them. This desire for a unique, unassailable legacy fueled his audacity, pushing him towards a gamble that any seasoned general would call suicide. His personal dream was simple: to command an operation so defining that the location of the victory would bear his name for 1,000 years. The most immediate and terrifying obstacle was the Strait of Gibraltar itself. It was a narrow corridor of water, less than 9 miles across at its closest point, but it was a swirling cauldron of cross currents and unpredictable winds, a treacherous pathway.
The small fleet provided by Count Julian was wholly inadequate for a military invasion. They were merchant vessels, likely small Byzantine dromons or fishing boats, built for coastal trade, not for ferrying thousands of armed men across a tidal nexus. The crossing began in small, staggered groups, a logistical nightmare that stretched the commander's patience and the men's resolve. The first waves landed under the cover of night and mist, the silence broken only by the creak of timber and the slosh of water against the hulls. With each successful transit, the boats had to turn immediately, fighting the currents to return to the African side. This slow, agonizing shuttling process meant Tariq's force would be fragmented, vulnerable, and completely exposed for days on the foreign shore. The men who had already crossed were stranded, looking back at the diminishing lights of Africa, knowing that any storm could sever their lifeline, leaving them isolated deep in enemy territory. Fear was a palpable enemy that crossed with them. The sheer logistical risk was unprecedented. A single, well-placed Visigothic naval patrol, had they possessed one, could have scattered the fragile fleet and drowned the invasion before it had truly begun. The weather itself was a constant threat. The winds could turn a quick crossing into an hours-long battle for survival, soaking the meager supplies and exhausting the soldiers before they had even formed ranks on the shore. This initial phase was a test of faith in the plan, demanding absolute trust in Tariq's meticulous timing and the reliability of Julian's small, often untested ships. Every scene on the water was a silent prayer for calm seas and swift passage. Upon landing, the troops immediately sought the high ground, finding an immense, monolithic rock formation dominating the coast. This natural fortress became their beachhead, a stark, unyielding statement of their arrival. Tariq established his headquarters on this outcrop, later known to the Arabs as Jabal Tariq, Tariq's mountain. It was a visible declaration. They were not leaving, and the land itself was now their primary defender. The soldiers, exhausted from the sea journey, had to immediately fortify their position, using the few tools and materials they carried. Every man was acutely aware that the vast, hostile plains of Hispania stretched out before them, a land of unknown dangers. Securing the beachhead involved posting sentries in the high caves of the rock, watching the empty horizons for the first signs of the inevitable Visigothic response. The silence of the alien land was more unnerving than the sounds of battle. Food and water were immediate concerns. They were dependent on their initial rations and had to cautiously forage the immediate surroundings, knowing that every movement risked exposing their small force to local patrols. The commander had to immediately instill iron discipline, preventing any unauthorized movement or looting that could give away their position and prematurely alert the distant King Roderick to the true scale of the invasion. It was during these tense first days, as the last of the men crossed, that Tariq is said to have made his most dramatic and defining choice: to destroy the ships. Whether literal or symbolic, the act confirmed that retreat was no longer an option.
The second and greater obstacle was the Visigothic king Roderick himself. Though his initial response was dangerously slow, he was preoccupied far to the north, dealing with residual political strife and suppressing uprisings. When the first fragmented reports of a large raiding party reached the king, they were dismissed as a mere barbarian incursion, easily dealt with by local garrisons. This fatal underestimation bought Tariq precious weeks to consolidate his forces. The intelligence Roderick received was deliberately poor, possibly distorted by Count Julian's network of sympathizers, painting a picture of a small, disorganized band of plunderers, not a serious invading army. Roderick's overconfidence was his downfall. He believed that his forces, heirs to the Roman military tradition, were invincible against the light infantry of North Africa, failing to comprehend the speed and motivation of Tariq's troops. Even when the true scope of the invasion began to filter through the court, the king moved ponderously, gathering the various noble retinues and mobilizing the large, heavy infantry formations required by his Visigothic doctrine. The king's lack of immediate response allowed Tariq to push north, moving out of the coastal area and seizing control of key defensible towns like Algeciras, securing their rear and gaining access to better supplies. As Tariq marched, he systematically bypassed the strongest fortifications, focusing instead on swift shock assaults on less defended centers, expanding his footprint with astonishing speed and gathering local allies.
The true fear began when the enemy finally coalesced. Messengers and scouts returned from the north with grim reports. King Roderick was finally gathering his massive army, summoning nobles from across the kingdom. The Visigothic force was rumored to number in the tens of thousands. Some accounts suggest close to 100,000 men, vastly outnumbering Tariq's meager 7,000 to 12,000 initial soldiers. The scale of the threat was overwhelming. This impending collision was the central nightmare, a small, light force of Berbers facing the combined heavy military might of the entire Iberian Peninsula, led by its crowned king. It was a mismatch of epic proportions. The morale of Tariq's men, high from the initial successes, now faced a brutal reality check. The prospect of fighting a seemingly endless sea of heavy, mail-clad infantry and cavalry was a terrifying thought. Tariq knew that he could not win a prolonged war of attrition. His only chance lay in a swift, decisive battle, forcing a single confrontation where his superior mobility and the enemy's political disunity could be exploited. He led his army not to retreat, but to meet the enemy, marching north and west into the heart of the Visigothic lands, committing to the location that would define the war, the banks of the Guadalete River. Tariq's smaller army arrived first, occupying a strategically advantageous position near the Guadalete River, some historians placing the location near Lake Lajanda. The landscape was a mix of rolling hills and open fields, allowing for mobile cavalry action, but also offering small elevations to anchor the light infantry. He immediately ordered the construction of a simple, field-hastened encampment, focusing on creating strong defensive lines at night and concealing the true, meager size of his force. Psychological warfare was as crucial as steel. The Berber commander spent his days meticulously studying the terrain, identifying potential ambush points, and planning withdrawal routes that he hoped would never be needed. Every soldier knew their exact role in the formation. Then, the Visigothic host arrived. It was a terrifying spectacle, a vast, glittering wave of heavy cavalry and infantry, their banners snapping in the wind, stretching across the plains for as far as the eye could see. King Roderick positioned his army with the confidence of an established monarch facing a rabble. His command structure was rigid, relying on the sheer weight and momentum of his forces to crush the intruders. The days leading up to the battle were a tense, silent standoff. The sound of distant horns and the muffled movements of tens of thousands of men across the river were a relentless psychological assault on Tariq's outnumbered troops. Tariq, however, observed the Visigothic camp closely, recognizing the fatal flaw in the king's arrangement. The separate retinues of the disgruntled noble factions placed defensively on the flanks, subtly isolated from the center. He knew his primary strength lay not in force, but in speed and unity, and crucially, in the deep-seated divisions among his enemy. He understood that a kingdom fractured against itself cannot stand against a cohesive vanguard. He walked among his soldiers, reminding them of the stakes. Retreat was impossible, and their very existence now depended on a single, coordinated, and perfect act of military aggression. He focused their morale not on fear, but on necessity. The commander reinforced his front line with archers and slingers, preparing to unleash a torrent of projectiles meant not to kill outright, but to sow chaos and confusion among the dense formations of the enemy. The air grew heavy with the dust kicked up by the thousands of hooves and the smell of fear and anticipation, a primal atmosphere that precedes the moment of history's greatest changes. The river, normally a tranquil ribbon of water, now acted as a symbolic and practical divide, separating two fundamentally different worlds poised for annihilation. On the designated morning, the battle was initiated not with a grand charge, but with a deliberate, harassing probe by Tariq's light cavalry, testing the Visigothic flanks to confirm their disengagement from the center. King Roderick, eager to end the skirmish, ordered his central formations to advance, a massive wall of heavy infantry and armored horsemen moving slowly and deliberately toward the enemy. The collision was brutal and deafening, a sickening sound of splintering shields and steel meeting bone. Tariq's forces held the initial shock, relying on disciplined retreat and agile counterstrikes to avoid being enveloped. The Berber strategy was one of tactical withdrawal, drawing the heavily armored Visigoths deeper into the field, forcing them to expend energy and disrupting their rigid formations. They were fighting the battle of a gazelle against a rhinoceros. Tariq's archers poured volleys into the Visigothic flanks, targeting the retinues commanded by Roderick's rivals, the sons of the deposed King Witiza. This action was a strategic signal, a catalyst for the betrayal he anticipated. The initial hours were a bloody, confused melee, a testament to the sheer physical disparity between the two armies. The Visigoths, though cumbersome, maintained their lines by sheer weight of numbers. Tariq himself was a commanding presence, moving along the rearguard, shouting orders, and using his command to ensure that the formations remained flexible, never allowing the enemy to pin his troops down. As the sun climbed, the heat and the ceaseless close-quarters combat began to take a toll on the heavily armored Visigoths, whose fatigue was exploited by the more lightly equipped Berber soldiers. A critical moment arrived when Tariq ordered his best cavalry units into a feigned retreat, luring a portion of the Visigothic center into an overzealous pursuit, thus creating a crucial gap in the enemy line. The commander launched a sudden, fierce counterattack into the exposed center, a spearhead aimed directly at the heart of the Visigothic defense, knowing that only the king's death could truly end the resistance. The turning point was the betrayal, a prearranged action that shattered the integrity of the Visigothic state. The factions loyal to the sons of the deposed King Witiza, placed on the flanks, chose this moment to pull back, feigning panic or retreat. The withdrawal of the flanks was immediately seen by the central forces as a complete rout, a catastrophic failure of command that sent a wave of paralyzing confusion through the army. This deliberate act of self-sabotage was the poison Roderick had unknowingly carried into battle. His political enemies had now delivered the final blow to his kingdom for the sake of their personal vendetta. Tariq seized the opportunity instantly, committing his remaining reserve forces to widen the gap between the Visigothic center and the withdrawing wings, effectively isolating King Roderick's personal guard. The sight of their own nobles abandoning the field broke the morale of the common Visigothic soldiers, turning their formation from a disciplined line into a chaotic, panicked mass seeking escape. The battle devolved into a relentless chase. Tariq's light cavalry, suddenly masters of the field, pursued the fleeing enemy, turning the tide from a military engagement into an unmitigated slaughter. The fate of King Roderick remains shrouded in historical debate. Some accounts claim he was struck down in the confusion, others that he drowned attempting to flee the battlefield, his royal mount being found riderless. What is certain is that the king vanished. The disappearance of the monarch, the ultimate symbol of the state, was the final irreversible signal of the collapse of the Visigothic kingdom. The battle, which had lasted 8 days according to some sources, ended not with a formal surrender, but with the total dissolution of the state's military capacity. Tariq's audacious gamble had paid off completely. The fields of Guadalete were now stained with the blood of a vanished empire. The victory was total, not just because the enemy was defeated, but because the central authority of the entire peninsula had been destroyed in a single day. The afternoon of the battle's end marked the fundamental, irrevocable shift in the history of Iberia. The vast, empty territory of the peninsula, now devoid of a central ruling power, was suddenly open for the taking. For Tariq's men, the realization was staggering. They had expected a battle for survival and a secured foothold. They had achieved the complete decapitation of a kingdom. They were no longer raiders, but conquerors. The psychological transformation was absolute. The fear of being stranded was replaced by the exhilarating knowledge of boundless opportunity. The whole of Hispania was now within their reach, its wealth undefended. Tariq, standing victorious on the field, understood the gravity of the moment. He had surpassed all expectations, turning a strategic beachhead into a decisive military victory that transcended his previous status. His victory sent shockwaves far beyond the Iberian Peninsula. To the Umayyad Caliphate in Damascus, the news was received with a mixture of delight at the expansion and profound political concern over Tariq's independent glory.
The decisive nature of the win meant that the slow, century-long process of consolidating the kingdom, which might have taken generations of warfare, was accomplished in a single lightning-fast campaign. Tariq immediately reorganized his forces, sending small detachments of highly mobile troops to capitalize on the chaos. His new objective was not simply to fight, but to receive the surrenders of the cities. His subsequent movements became a masterful demonstration of military opportunism, moving faster than news could travel, accepting favorable terms from local Visigothic governors desperate to avoid bloodshed. The name Jabal Tariq, the Rock of Tariq, was born, a permanent, physical monument to the moment of his landing, cementing his personal role in this epochal event. The fate of the peninsula was sealed. Its destiny would no longer be purely European, but an intricate, enduring blend of European and North African culture, language, and civilization, soon to be known as Al-Andalus. With the Visigothic king and army dissolved, Tariq understood that the war had immediately transformed from a military engagement into a campaign of rapid administration. Time was the enemy, and speed was his only shield against organized resistance. His army, now bolstered by captured supplies and local recruits, split into smaller, fast-moving columns, each tasked with securing key urban centers with minimal delay. Their objective was not annihilation, but control. One key column raced toward Córdoba, the city of the ancient Roman south. The city, initially thought impregnable, fell quickly after a short siege, opening the rich Guadalquivir valley to the invaders. Tariq immediately led the main force toward Toledo, the spiritual and political capital of the Visigothic kingdom, believing that capturing the heart of the state would trigger a domino effect of surrender. The approach to Toledo was a swift, almost uncontested march. The city, having received reports of the Guadalete disaster and the disappearance of the king, was gripped by terror and internal disorder.
Local populations, including the oppressed Jewish communities who had suffered persecution under the Visigothic code, often saw the invaders as liberators, or, at the very least, as a preferable change of regime. This alliance of convenience proved critical. Local guides and inside knowledge smoothed the path of Tariq's troops, allowing them to bypass defenses and exploit the breakdown of civic authority. The gates of Toledo were opened, some historical accounts suggest, by dissident elements within the city itself. Tariq entered the capital of Hispania almost unopposed, a stunning victory achieved in mere weeks. Inside Toledo, Tariq seized the royal treasury, a trove of gold, jewels, and ancient artifacts, the tangible wealth of centuries of Visigothic rule. This immense spoil confirmed the value of his gamble. The psychological impact of Toledo's fall was profound. If the capital could not resist, then no city could. The remainder of the peninsula understood that the political order was irrevocably finished. The news of Tariq's successes, the fall of the capital, the seizure of the treasury, the total collapse of the kingdom, reached Musa ibn Nusayr in Ifriqiya with a mixture of immense satisfaction and burning resentment. Musa had authorized a reconnaissance, a large-scale raid, not the conquest of an empire by his subordinate. Tariq's unparalleled success overshadowed Musa's own long and distinguished career. Driven by a need to assert his authority and claim his rightful share of the glory and spoils, Musa decided to cross the strait himself, leading a second, much larger army, predominantly composed of Arab forces. Musa's army crossed in the summer of 712, a year after Tariq's initial landing, and followed a different, more methodical route, methodically conquering the major centers that Tariq had bypassed or left under tenuous control. Musa captured Seville, the crucial administrative and port city, after a sustained and difficult siege, ensuring his command had secured a major victory independent of Tariq's lightning campaign. He then moved on to the fiercely defended city of Mérida, which resisted tenaciously. The prolonged siege of Mérida provided Musa with the opportunity to showcase the steady, methodical power of his professional Arab forces. The stage was set for an inevitable, tense meeting between the two commanders. Musa demanded that Tariq halt his advance immediately and await the arrival of his superior. Tariq, deep in the north, near the Ebro Valley, was reluctant but compliant, recognizing that to challenge Musa militarily would lead to an internal conflict that would destroy their conquests. He returned south to meet his superior. The commanders finally met at a prearranged location near Talavera, or possibly in the environs of Toledo, a meeting charged with rivalry and historical consequence. This was the clash of ambition and authority. Historical accounts describe a dramatic and humiliating confrontation. Musa, enraged by Tariq's independent glory and his failure to wait for his superior, allegedly struck the Berber commander in front of the assembled troops. Musa demanded a full accounting of the campaign, including the vast treasures seized from Toledo. He asserted his supreme authority, stripping Tariq of independent command and integrating his forces into the governor's larger army. For Tariq, the moment was a devastating political defeat. He had won the war, yet lost the political control over his conquest, subjugated once again to the very hierarchy he had tried to transcend. The following months saw the two men march together, completing the pacification of the northern regions, but the relationship was one of tense, enforced cooperation, not partnership. The jealousy was palpable. Their joint final conquests were swift and comprehensive, cementing Umayyad control over the vast majority of the peninsula, pushing the border up to the Pyrenees Mountains. The news of the unparalleled success, however, had traveled all the way to Damascus, generating concern in the court of the Caliph Al-Walid I. The power amassed by Musa and the renown of Tariq were deemed too great. An urgent summons arrived from the distant Caliph, recalling both Musa and Tariq to Damascus
to give an account of the campaign and the spoils of war. This order was final and absolute. Tariq and Musa, the conquerors of a kingdom, were reduced to escorted prisoners, forced to abandon their newfound empire and travel thousands of miles east to face political judgment. The recall of its two principal architects did not halt the momentum of the conquest. Iberia, now known as Al-Andalus, was successfully integrated as a province of the vast Umayyad Caliphate. The new administration, initially led by Musa's son, established a political structure that, while firm, was notably tolerant compared to the previous Visigothic rule, especially towards Jews and various Christian sects. The establishment of Al-Andalus marked the true beginning of one of the most intellectually and culturally rich periods in European history, a fusion of classical, North African, and Eastern scholarship. The wealth seized by Tariq and Musa fueled the early stability of the province, financing the construction of mosques, schools, and infrastructure, transforming the newly acquired territory. Al-Andalus quickly became a crucial cultural bridge, preserving and advancing knowledge in mathematics, astronomy, and medicine during Europe's Dark Ages, leaving an enduring footprint on Western civilization. Upon their arrival in Damascus, the political drama reached its conclusion. Musa was publicly disgraced, fined heavily, and stripped of his remaining authority, eventually dying in obscurity. Tariq ibn Ziyad, the soldier who took the greatest risk, fared marginally better. He was reportedly allowed to live out his remaining years in a quiet, politically harmless role, his glory confined to the past. The man who had shattered a kingdom and crossed the boundary of continents ended his life far from the land that bore his name, a testament to the brutal, fickle nature of imperial power and court politics. His memory, however, proved more resilient than the political careers of his rivals. While the details of his later life faded, the story of his audacity on the African shore became legend. The massive rock, the first witness to his arrival, stood as his most permanent monument. Jabal Tariq, Gibraltar, is an immutable reminder that a single act of courage can change the destiny of entire civilizations. The legacy of Tariq is a complex tapestry, not just the success of the invasion, but the profound, permanent alteration of the West, demonstrating that true historical change is often initiated by the daring of an outsider. He remains the eternal symbol of the high-stakes gamble, the leader who burned the ships, choosing irrevocable commitment over the safety of retreat, forever linking his name to the moment Iberia changed forever.
And so the legacy of the Visigothic kingdom was swept away by a single bold crossing, replaced by the enduring, complex civilization of Al-Andalus. But the forces that drove Tariq and Musa, ambition, rivalry, and the relentless search for power, did not die on the plains of Guadalete. They continued to churn the fate of the caliphate itself, leading us to our next story, the massive revolt that would shake the Umayyad dynasty to its core and eventually carve out a new, independent caliphate right here, in the heart of the land Tariq conquered.